What if the most dangerous intelligence operation in the Middle East wasn't built on a spy? What if it was built on a mistake, made by the very people trying to stop it? There is a gas field in the Persian Gulf that Iran never thought anyone would touch. Not because it was hidden, not because it was buried underground or surrounded by missile batteries, but because striking it meant striking the entire global energy order at once. One field, 40 years of assumed immunity, and a single analyst who looked at data nobody else wanted to look at. His name was never released. In the records that surfaced later, he's referred to only by a unit designation inside Israeli military intelligence. For the purposes of this story, and because what he did will matter more than what any field operative did, we'll call him the cartographer. This is not a story about soldiers. It's a story about what happens when intelligence gets too good and what it quietly destroys in the process. To understand the operation, you have to understand what Iran built South Pars to be. It isn't a classified installation. It doesn't appear on restricted maps or intelligence watch lists the way Natanz or Fordo do. South Pars sits in open water in the middle of the Persian Gulf, producing more natural gas than any other single field on the planet. The coordinates are published. The production figures are reported to international energy bodies every quarter. Western analysts have studied it for decades. That transparency was the point. The field straddles the maritime boundary between Iran and Qatar. Qatar calls its half the North Field. On it, Qatar built one of the wealthiest economies per capita in the world. LNG contracts with Japan, South Korea, Germany, France, the United Kingdom. Qatar also hosts Al Udeid Air Base, the largest American military installation in the Middle East. Any strike on South Pars wouldn't just hurt Iran. It would send a shockwave through every one of those relationships simultaneously. Iran understood this. They didn't hide the field. They placed it behind something more durable than secrecy. They placed it behind consequences. For 40 years, that protection held. The cartographer was not supposed to be studying South Pars. His formal assignment in late 2023 was a different category entirely, monitoring Iranian petrochemical export diversion patterns related to sanctioned revenue flows. Routine signals intelligence work, the kind of analysis that generates monthly reports that senior officers skim and file. But sometime in the autumn of 2024, he noticed something that didn't fit the pattern he was supposed to be tracking. A fluctuation in domestic Iranian natural gas pricing. Not dramatic, not publicly reported, but visible if you were watching the right provincial distribution data. Northern Iranian provinces were receiving less gas during peak winter months than their infrastructure was rated to handle. Tehran was calling it maintenance, routine upgrades. The cartographer didn't believe it, not because he had a source inside Iran's energy ministry, but because the timing was wrong. Maintenance doesn't cluster in winter, and the affected provinces weren't near any facility undergoing documented upgrades. He pulled a second data set, AIS tracking, the automatic identification signals that commercial vessels broadcast in the Persian Gulf. He began cross-referencing tanker movements near Escalation, the onshore processing hub in Bushehr province, where South Pars gas is cleaned, compressed, and routed for domestic and export use. He found something. Certain tankers operating in proximity to Escalation were deviating from their registered routes. Not dramatically, 4 to 7 nautical miles, at irregular intervals. Enough to avoid the standard satellite monitoring corridors used by Western intelligence agencies to track Iranian condensate exports. This was not noise. This was a signature. Iran was quietly routing condensate shipments through secondary channels because the primary terminals were running above declared capacity. South Pars wasn't operating at 80%, It was being pushed past its structural limit to compensate for sanctioned revenue shortfalls elsewhere in the Iranian economy. The field was fragile, and Iran knew it. The cartographer submitted his analysis in January 2025. He attached a single line at the bottom of the report that his supervisor later said he almost deleted before forwarding it up the chain. The line read, "If Asaluye is operating beyond the equipment tolerance, a precision strike on 2 processing nodes could trigger cascade shutdown across multiple phases without requiring simultaneous multi-site targeting." His supervisor forwarded the report. It sat in a queue for 11 weeks. During those 11 weeks, the cartographer continued pulling data. He wasn't authorized to expand the scope of his analysis. He did it anyway, not out of ambition, but because the pattern kept producing new details he couldn't ignore. He began building what he internally called a pressure map, a model of how gas flow through the Asaluye processing system would behave under various damage scenarios. He made one assumption at the center of that model. He assumed the Iranian security architecture around Asaluye hadn't changed significantly since the last publicly available construction records from 2019. That assumption was going to cost him. In the spring of 2025, the cartographer's initial report finally reached a senior analyst inside Unit 8200 WAS, Israel's Signals Intelligence Division, who flagged it for escalation. Within 2 weeks, it was in front of a planning desk that had, for years, kept South Pars categorized as a low-probability target precisely because of the diplomatic consequences its destruction would trigger. The framing in the cartographer's report changed the conversation. This wasn't about destroying South Pars. It was about surgical disruption, damaging enough of the processing infrastructure to force an economic crisis inside Iran without triggering a full reservoir-level event that would pull Qatar into the conflict as a damaged party. The distinction mattered enormously. A destroyed field meant a regional war with energy stakes too high for any Western government to manage. A disrupted processing hub meant a targeted blow to Iranian IRGC revenue, painful, deniable at the infrastructure level, and calibrated to stay below the threshold of Qatari involvement. Planning teams began modeling strike packages based on the cartographer's pressure map. 2 processing nodes, refinery number 4, and a secondary transmission junction. Together, they handled 100 million cubic meters of daily output. Together, they were the load-bearing points of the entire Asaluye system. The cartographer was brought into a preliminary briefing, unusual for an analyst at his classification level. He walked the planning team through his pressure modeling. He answered every question directly. He flagged 2 areas of uncertainty in his data: the exact positions of Iran's newer anti-drone radar clusters near the coast, and the current guard rotation schedule at the facility perimeter. He flagged them. And then, under pressure from the timeline, he estimated around them. What neither the cartographer nor the planning team knew was that Iran had already noticed something was wrong. Not with South Pars specifically, not yet, but Iranian Intelligence Minister Ismail Khatib had authorized a broad sweep of suspected Mossad informant networks operating inside Iran's energy sector in the summer of 2025. The sweep was methodical. 14 suspected assets across Bushehr province were identified for investigation. 7 were arrested. 3 were, in fact, Mossad assets. 4 were not. Khatib's teams believed they had sanitized the network. They closed the files. They wrote the internal assessment that the South Pars facility's human intelligence exposure had been neutralized. They were partially right. But in conducting the sweep and documenting every security layer they believed they had protected, they had done something they didn't realize. They had recorded in encrypted government communications the exact structure of everything they were defending: guard rotations, camera blind spots, radar activation schedules, the precise coordinates of 3 hardened processing units that had never appeared in any commercial satellite image. Unit 8200 was already inside those communications channels. The sweep that Khatib ordered to protect South Pars had handed Israel something no informant could have provided: a complete, current, internally verified security map of the most protected energy asset in the Islamic Republic. The cartographer's assumption that the security architecture hadn't changed since 2019 was wrong. But the correction to that assumption had just arrived in the most unexpected way possible. And somewhere in a planning room in Tel Aviv, someone was reading Khatib's own counterintelligence report and updating the pressure map in real time. The field wasn't hidden. It never was. The question was never whether Israel could find it. The question was whether, once they struck it, they could control what came next. The intercepted communications from Khatib's counterintelligence sweep arrived in Unit 8200's processing pipeline across 3 separate transmissions in August of 2025. They weren't labeled. They didn't arrive with a subject line that said, "Here is the security architecture of South Pars." They arrived as encrypted internal correspondence between Iranian Ministry of Intelligence regional offices, the kind of traffic that gets logged, queued, and processed in order of priority. The analyst who first flagged the 3rd transmission as significant wasn't the cartographer. It was a younger signals operator on a night shift who noticed that a string of grid coordinates embedded inside what appeared to be a routine personnel transfer document didn't correspond to any known administrative facility in Bushehr province. She escalated it at 3 a.m. By 6 a.m., the cartographer was on a call he hadn't been scheduled for. When he saw the coordinates, he didn't speak for almost a minute. The grid references in the Iranian internal documents matched processing infrastructure at Asaluya that he had been estimating around for 6 months. Not approximately, precisely. The hardened condensate storage units that had never appeared in commercial satellite imagery. The underground pipeline junctions that his pressure model had inferred from flow rate data but never confirmed. The exact positions of the 3 anti-drone radar clusters installed after 2022, the ones he had flagged as gaps in his own analysis. All of it was there. Not because Mossad had placed an asset inside the facility, because Iran's own counterintelligence teams had documented every layer of security they believed they had secured and transmitted that documentation through channels that Unit 8200 had already compromised. The cartographer updated his pressure model that morning. What had been an estimate built on inference and 6-year-old construction records became something close to a verified architectural diagram. He ran new cascade modeling against the updated coordinates. The 2-node strike package he had originally proposed, refinery number 4, and the secondary transmission junction held. But the updated radar positions changed the approach geometry significantly. The entry corridor that planning teams had been quietly designating for a possible strike vector for 18 months was now partially covered by one of the newly confirmed radar clusters. He flagged it immediately. This time, no one filed it in a queue. By September 2025, the South Pars operation had moved from analytical planning into preliminary mission architecture. A small strike coordination team, drawn from Israeli Air Force targeting units and Unit 8200's Infrastructure Intelligence Division, began modeling delivery options against the updated facility map. The central problem wasn't detection. It wasn't even the entry corridor, though that remained a serious constraint. The central problem was Qatar. The geological reality of South Pars is that it doesn't respect national boundaries. The gas reservoir beneath the Persian Gulf is a single continuous formation. Iranian processing infrastructure and Qatari extraction infrastructure are drawing from the same underground pressure system. Any strike that damaged Iranian pipelines deeply enough to cause cascading failure risked creating a reverse pressure effect, a scenario in which the structural disruption propagated through the shared reservoir and impacted Qatari extraction rates on the other side of the maritime boundary. The energy modeling on this scenario was inconclusive. Different simulation runs produced different outcomes depending on variables that no one had reliable data for. The current pressure equilibrium across the reservoir, the exact state of Iranian pipeline integrity after years of deferred maintenance, the depth and density of the condensate formations closest to the maritime boundary. Some models showed minimal cross-reservoir impact. Others showed something that, in the words of one planning team member whose account surfaced later, nobody in this room wants to explain to Doha. Qatar hosts Al Udeid. Qatar had not been consulted. Qatar had not been warned. And Qatar's entire national economy rests on the stability of the same underground formation that Israel was now planning to partially destroy. The strike package had to be redesigned, not to protect Qatar out of diplomatic consideration, there was no time for that, but because pulling Qatar into the conflict as a damaged party would instantly internationalize the operation in a way that removed any possibility of Israeli deniability, and potentially triggered an American withdrawal from Al Udeid that no one in Washington or Tel Aviv wanted to contemplate. The targeting envelope shrank. 2 nodes became 2 very specific subsections of 2 nodes. The margin for error in munitions placement went from a standard blast radius calculation to something the targeting team described as surgical, in a way that made the word feel inadequate. The cartographer ran the revised delivery modeling twice, then a 3rd time. Then he told the planning team that the revised package was executable, but that it required a 47-second radar gap in the Iranian anti-drone rotation schedule near Asaluya. The gap existed. Unit 8200 had confirmed it across 6 weeks of consistent observation. Every 3 hours, the newest radar cluster entered a self-diagnostic cycle. During that cycle, its active sweep coverage dropped to approximately 40% of normal range. For 47 seconds, an approach corridor opened that would allow the strike package to reach its delivery position without confirmed radar acquisition. 47 seconds. Every 3 hours. Confirmed for 6 weeks. The planning team built the entire entry architecture around that gap. 3 days before the scheduled strike date of March 15, 2026, the gap changed. It wasn't dramatic. The diagnostic cycle didn't disappear. It shifted by 11 minutes. The window still existed, but the 11-minute displacement meant it no longer aligned with the approach timing the delivery package had been calibrated around. The aircraft couldn't simply depart 11 minutes earlier. The strike package involved coordination layers, deconfliction with other airspace activity, fuel load margins, a misdirection element involving a separate operation in Lebanon that was timed to pull Iranian intelligence attention northward before the main package was airborne. Every element of that timing had been interlocked. An 11-minute shift in the radar gap cascaded into a 2-hour problem in the sequencing architecture. The planning team had 2 options. Abort the March 15th date and rebuild the timeline, losing weeks, possibly longer, with no guarantee the radar gap would stabilize back into a predictable pattern. Or adapt the entry corridor to the new timing and accept a tighter abort margin than anyone on the team was comfortable with. The discussion, by accounts that emerged later, was not brief. One faction argued for abort. Not permanently, but long enough to reconfirm whether the radar shift was a one-time calibration event or a permanent schedule change. If it was permanent, the entire approach geometry needed to be rebuilt. If it was temporary, waiting a week would cost nothing except time. The counter-argument was operational security. The longer the planning cycle ran, the more transmissions it generated and the more exposure it created inside the intelligence channels that the operation depended on. Every additional week was another week in which Khatib's counterintelligence teams, or whoever replaced them, might notice the same anomaly in Iranian government communications that Unit 8200 had been quietly exploiting for months. The abort faction didn't lose the argument because they were wrong. They lost it because the timeline pressure was real, and no one at the decision level was willing to accept the alternative risk. The cartographer was asked directly, could the revised corridor work? He said yes, with a caveat that the condensate storage unit on the eastern perimeter of the transmission junction, which sat outside the original damage modeling envelope, needed to be rechecked against the revised blast radius calculation under the tighter delivery geometry. He was told there wasn't time to rerun the full model. He was asked if his existing modeling was close enough. He said he believed so. He was not certain. And he knew he was not certain. And he said yes anyway. This is the moment the operation stopped being a plan and started being a bet. Because what the planning team had built, what the cartographer's analysis had made possible, what Khatib's inadvertent gift had confirmed, was a strike package of genuine precision. The targeting was real. The corridor was real. The 47-second window, even shifted by 11 minutes, was real. But real intelligence and certain outcomes are not the same thing. The condensate storage unit that the cartographer hadn't fully remodeled sat inside a section of the Asaluya complex that his original pressure map had classified as secondary infrastructure. Not a priority target. Not a risk factor. He had classified it that way based on construction records from 2019. The same construction records he had already discovered were 6 years out of date. On March 15, 2026, the strike package lifted off. The misdirection layer, a separate Israeli operation against a Hezbollah logistics commander in southern Lebanon, executed as planned. Iranian intelligence attention shifted northward, consistent with the pattern Israel had observed and counted on. The aircraft were airborne for 11 minutes when a signal intercept reached the strike package commander. 2 Iranian fast attack craft had repositioned near the entry corridor within the previous 6 hours. Their positioning didn't look tactical. It looked routine, a patrol shift, the kind of movement that happens in the Persian Gulf dozens of times a day. But their new position placed them within radar detection range of aircraft approaching the corridor at the angle the strike package required. The intercept didn't confirm that Iran knew the strike was coming. It didn't confirm anything except a location change that may have been completely unrelated to the operation. The strike package commander had minutes to decide. He aborted. The aircraft turned back. And for the next 72 hours, the question that no one could answer, whether the patrol repositioning was coincidence or whether someone in Tehran had received a warning, sat at the center of every conversation in the planning room. They never fully resolved it. They launched anyway. The 72 hours after the aborted March 15th attempt were not spent rebuilding the plan. They were spent arguing about whether the plan was still viable at all. The patrol repositioning of the 2 Iranian fast attack craft hadn't been explained. Iranian naval movements in the Persian Gulf are logged continuously by multiple intelligence services, and in the days following the abort, analysts pulled every available data point on those 2 vessels. Their repositioning didn't match any scheduled exercise pattern. It didn't align with any known rotation schedule. But it also didn't produce any evidence of coordinated defensive activity. No change in air defense alert status at Asaluya. No increase in radar sweep frequency. No communication intercepts suggesting that Iranian Naval Command had been briefed on a potential Israeli approach. The most likely explanation was coincidence, a patrol adjustment, the kind of routine movement that happens in the Persian Gulf constantly and means nothing. The cartographer didn't believe coincidence was a sufficient basis for relaunching an operation of this scale. He said so in writing, in an internal assessment that he submitted on March 16th. His argument was precise. If the patrol movement was deliberate, if Iran had received even a fragmentary warning, then the approach corridor was now known, and using it again was not adapting to changed conditions. It was walking into a prepared position. He was overruled, not dismissed. Overruled. There is a difference. His concern was logged. The planning team's counter-argument was that the window for the operation was narrowing for reasons that had nothing to do with the corridor. The broader conflict timeline was accelerating. Every additional delay increased the probability that the decision would be taken out of military planners' hands entirely and absorbed into a diplomatic negotiation that would make the strike impossible. The cartographer's assessment was filed. The relaunch was authorized for March 18th. The sequencing for March 18th was rebuilt around a different logic than the original package. The misdirection layer was retained. The Lebanon operation had succeeded on March 15th, but its window for pulling Iranian intelligence attention northward had largely closed. A replacement was needed. The solution was more direct and more consequential than anyone on the planning team would later describe as comfortable. In the pre-dawn hours of March 18th, Israel moved against Esmail Khatib, the intelligence minister who had ordered the counterintelligence sweep, the man whose teams had inadvertently handed Unit 8200 the security architecture of South Pars, the man who, if he had understood what his own encrypted communications had disclosed, would have been the person most capable of triggering an emergency defensive posture around Asaluye before the strike package arrived. Khatib was killed before dawn. The planning team's calculation was specific. The elimination of Iran's intelligence minister would not prevent Iranian forces at South Pars from defending the facility. It would degrade the speed and coherence of Iran's command response during the hours immediately following the strike. New personnel, unclear authority chains, communication protocols in review. Not paralysis. A delay. And a delay in this operation was the margin. The strike package lifted off in the late morning of March 18th. This time, no intercept came in during the first 11 minutes. The aircraft held their heading. The entry corridor was clear. The Iranian fast attack craft that had triggered the abort 3 days earlier were in a different position, further south, well outside the detection envelope. At the planning room level, this was read as confirmation that the March 15th repositioning had been coincidental. The cartographer read it differently. He was present at the monitoring station when the corridor confirmation came through. His concern wasn't the fast attack craft. His concern was why they had moved south. Routine patrol completion, scheduled repositioning. Both were plausible, but he had spent 6 months building models out of exactly this kind of movement data, and the pattern of their southward shift didn't match any rotation sequence in the database he'd been maintaining. He didn't say anything. The aircraft were already past the point where his concern would have changed the outcome, and he wasn't certain. He had already been wrong once by being too certain. He watched the monitoring display and said nothing. At 2:07 p.m. local time, the strike package reached its delivery position. The 47-second radar gap, shifted 11 minutes from its original schedule, now confirmed across 3 additional days of observation, opened on time. The first munition was released at 2:08 p.m. It struck refinery number 4 at 2:10 p.m. The impact point was within 4 meters of the calculated optimal junction, the specific pipe convergence that the cartographer's pressure model had identified as the load-bearing point of the entire northern processing cluster. The blast severed 3 primary feed lines simultaneously. Automatic safety systems triggered within seconds, initiating a controlled shutdown of the refinery's active processing units. For approximately 90 seconds, the monitoring team read this as a clean execution. The blast radius was within the modeled envelope. No secondary ignitions were visible on the thermal imaging feed. The facility's emergency response teams were moving toward the impact site, not toward the condensate storage units to the east. One analyst at the monitoring station said, quietly, that it looked like it was going to hold. That was the moment it stopped holding. The second munition hit the transmission junction at 2:11 p.m. The junction strike was where the cartographer's incomplete remodeling surfaced. The transmission junction had been targeted as a secondary node, a pressure release point that, when disrupted, would force the shutdown cascade to extend beyond refinery number 4 and into 2 additional processing phases. The model predicted a contained blast, a pipeline rupture manageable within the facility's emergency response protocols, and no significant secondary ignition risk. What the model didn't account for was the condensate storage unit on the eastern perimeter, the one the cartographer had classified as secondary infrastructure based on 2019 construction records, the one he hadn't had time to remodel under the revised delivery geometry. In the 6 years since those construction records were filed, the storage unit had been expanded. not dramatically. An additional condensate tank, added during a 2022 infrastructure upgrade that appeared nowhere in the records the cartographer had access to. It sat closer to the junction blast radius than the original structure, and it was holding a higher condensate volume than any tank at that location had ever held before, because South Pars had been running above capacity for months. The junction blast ignited it. Not immediately. There was a delay of approximately 4 minutes, long enough that the monitoring team had already begun assessing the strike as successfully concluded. Long enough that one transmission had already gone out confirming primary objectives achieved. Then, the thermal imaging feed showed a new ignition signature east of the junction site, outside the predicted damage envelope. Growing. The cartographer saw it before anyone else in the room identified what it was. He recognized the location on the facility map immediately. He said the name of the storage unit out loud, not urgently, not as an alarm, just as a statement of recognition, the way someone says the name of a thing they had been afraid of and are now watching arrive. The secondary fire burned for 9 hours. It destroyed the condensate storage unit entirely. It spread to a secondary pipeline cluster adjacent to the storage unit. Infrastructure that hadn't been part of the strike plan, hadn't been part of the pressure modeling, and hadn't been part of anyone's assessment of acceptable damage. The total destruction exceeded the planned envelope by a margin that no one on the planning team had authorized. What was designed as a surgical disruption of 2 processing nodes had produced a larger, less controlled event, still far from the catastrophic reservoir-level damage that would have pulled Qatar into the conflict, but significantly beyond the parameters that had been approved. At Escalation, facility operators shut down 2 additional processing phases to prevent the fire from spreading further. They did this independently, without waiting for orders from Tehran. 100 million cubic meters of daily capacity went offline, and then the emergency shutdowns added more. For a period of approximately 40 minutes, South Pars ran at a fraction of its operational output. In the planning room, there was no celebration. There was a silence that lasted long enough to be uncomfortable, and then a series of very measured, very careful conversations about what had just happened versus what had been planned. The primary objectives had been achieved. Refinery number 4 was down. The transmission junction was destroyed. The cascade shutdown had extended beyond the 2 targeted nodes, exactly as the pressure model had predicted. The secondary fire was not in the plan. The condensate storage unit was not in the plan. The additional pipeline damage was not in the plan. And somewhere in the monitoring data, the southward movement of the 2 Iranian fast attack craft still had no explanation. The operation was not over. It had simply reached the point where the parts that had been planned were finished, and the parts that hadn't been planned were just beginning. The secondary fire at Escalation was still burning when the first diplomatic communication arrived in Jerusalem. It didn't come from Tehran, it came from Doha. Qatar's foreign ministry sent a formal inquiry through back-channel intermediaries within 3 hours of the strike. Not a protest, not yet, but a request for technical clarification on whether the Israeli operation had affected reservoir pressure integrity on the Qatari side of the maritime boundary. The language was measured. The subtext was not. Qatar was asking whether its own gas field, the economic foundation of its entire national existence, had just been damaged by an operation it had no knowledge of and no part in. The Israeli response was that reservoir integrity had been maintained, that the strike had been calibrated precisely to avoid cross-boundary pressure effects, that the Qatari North Field was unaffected. All of that was technically accurate. What it didn't address was the condensate storage unit that hadn't been in the model, the secondary fire that burned for 9 hours, the additional pipeline damage that extended the destruction beyond the approved parameters, the parts of the operation that hadn't been calibrated because there hadn't been time to recalibrate them. Qatar didn't know about those parts, and Israel wasn't volunteering the information. By the evening of March 18th, the public statements had begun layering in contradictions that would take weeks to untangle. Iran's state media initially denied any significant damage. then acknowledged a fire at a processing facility, then attributed the strike to both Israel and the United States simultaneously, without distinguishing between the two. The United States issued a statement through the White House saying it had no involvement in the attack. Trump told reporters that the U.S. had known nothing about it. That same evening, 2 senior Israeli officials and a U.S. defense official confirmed to American media that the strike had been communicated to Washington in advance, not requested, not jointly planned, but disclosed before execution. These were not the same thing. But in the hours after the strike, the distinction collapsed in public perception faster than anyone in Jerusalem or Washington had anticipated. The operation had been designed to be Israeli, deniable at the level of joint action, attributable only to Israel's unilateral decision-making. That framing lasted approximately 6 hours before the coordination layer became public knowledge. Trump subsequently stated he had cautioned Israel against striking Iranian energy sites. He then ruled out further Israeli strikes on Iranian energy infrastructure, a statement that Israel had not agreed to in advance, and that immediately created a public constraint on Israeli operational planning that hadn't existed the morning before. The cartographer's analysis had been built to support a surgical, deniable disruption. What it had produced, in combination with the secondary fire and the rushed diplomatic response, was an event that was larger than planned, more attributed than intended, and constrained by American public statements that no one in the planning room had factored into the post-strike environment. The institutional cost surfaced quietly in the weeks after March 18th. An internal review was opened, not publicly, not with any announcement, to assess how the condensate storage unit had been missed. The review focused on 3 decision points: the cartographer's initial classification of the eastern perimeter as secondary infrastructure, the planning team's decision not to allow time for a full remodel before the March 18th launch, and the senior authorization that had overruled the cartographer's post-abort concern about the patrol repositioning. The review didn't produce a finding of misconduct. It produced something more difficult to categorize: a documented record of a sequence of individually defensible decisions that had collectively produced an outcome beyond the approved parameters. The cartographer was not disciplined. He was reassigned, not to a lesser role, to a different one. Infrastructure vulnerability analysis, the work he had been doing when he first noticed the South Pars anomaly, was quietly folded into a new internal review process that required secondary verification for any pressure modeling used in active strike planning. The process change was named internally after a designation number, not after the operation, not after the facility, after the specific modeling protocol that had been used, and that had been insufficient. He had built the map that made the operation possible. The institutional response to what he had built was to make sure no one could use a map like his again without a second pair of hands checking every assumption. On April 5, 2026, Israel struck South Pars again. This time, the target was the Asaluya petrochemical complex, not the gas processing infrastructure but the downstream chemical production facilities that the first strike hadn't touched. Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz confirmed publicly that the complex was responsible for approximately 50% of Iran's total petrochemical production. The second strike was larger, less constrained by the Qatar reservoir modeling because it targeted onshore petrochemical infrastructure rather than the offshore connected processing units. More visible, more deliberately escalatory. Between the first and second strikes, Iran had moved. Not against Israel directly, not in a way that produced a single dramatic counterstrike, but across the Gulf energy architecture that Israel's operation had implicitly threatened. Iranian-aligned forces targeted energy facilities in other Gulf states. The attacks were calibrated below the threshold of full military confrontation, but above the threshold of deniability. The message was specific: if South Pars is a legitimate target, then the logic that made it untouchable for 40 years no longer applies to anything. Saudi Arabia's energy ministry issued a statement about dangerous precedents. The UAE used language about threats to regional energy infrastructure stability that hadn't appeared in their official communications in years. Kuwait quietly began security reviews of its own processing facilities. The wall of consequences that had protected South Pars for 4 decades hadn't just been breached. It had been publicly dismantled. Every state in the Gulf was now recalculating what was off-limits and what was not based on their own intentions, but based on the new operational reality that Israel had demonstrated. The cartographer's original analysis had been correct in every conclusion it drew about South Pars itself. The fragility assessment was accurate. The cascade modeling for the 2-node strike was accurate. The identification of Escalation as the pressure load-bearing point of the entire field was accurate. What his analysis couldn't model, what no intelligence analysis can model, was what the operation would authorize by succeeding. He had demonstrated that South Pars could be struck precisely enough to avoid reservoir-level consequences. That a target previously classified as untouchable due to diplomatic complexity was actually reachable if the execution was sufficiently calibrated. He had proven the concept. And in proving it, he had handed that concept to every actor in the region simultaneously. The proof of concept wasn't classified. It was visible on satellite imagery 3 days after the strike. It was confirmed by Iranian state media, international energy markets, and the subsequent second strike on April 5th. The operation didn't open a door, it removed a door, and doors, once removed, do not close again because the person who removed them decides they should. South Pars is still producing gas. Partially. The phases that were shut down in March have not returned to full capacity. The condensate storage unit the cartographer didn't remodel is offline. The secondary pipeline cluster damaged by the fire he didn't predict is under repair. The field is running, but not the way it was running on March 17th. And somewhere in the planning rooms of every significant regional military force, not just Israel, not just Iran, there is now an updated target list, with South Pars on it. Not as an exceptional case requiring extraordinary justification. As a precedent. The cartographer built a map. The map was used. The map worked mostly in the ways it was designed to work. What the map didn't show, what maps never show, is what gets built in the space left behind. Hidden Ops covers intelligence operations through the decisions that shaped them, not the versions that got cleaned up afterward. If that's the kind of history you want to understand, subscribe. New operations when the story is ready.